Welcome to the new series of webinars from Emergency Services Times. I'm Catherine Levin and I'm the editor of Emergency Services Times. Our intention with this series is to continue the conversation that we started at the Emergency Services Show, where many of our speakers joined us to share their work. We'll cover a range of topics, and in this first series we're covering resilience, drones and today's topic of electric vehicles. We ask our speakers to share their work, their insights and their thoughts on the future. And of course, our unique selling point with the Emergency Services Show and the Emergency Services Times is that we are multi-agency, so you'll always get a view from across the blue lights. This webinar is a chat, no presentations, no slides, but a valuable conversation that leaves you inspired to find out more. We have a Q&A function in our webinar software, so please do contribute questions and we will get to those as much as we can. You'll also receive CPD accreditation for attending this webinar. You'll receive confirmation about this by email after the recording, and those of you watching on catch-up will receive it as well. Our plan is to run for 45 minutes in total, so let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce Andy Brown, Andy Butterfield, Chris Rutherford and Paul Leach, who will join us on the screen now. Just wait for them to appear. Welcome to you all. Let's make sure everybody's there. 1, 2,
Hello.
3, 4, and me. Brilliant. Thank you. So I'm delighted to introduce you all to the webinar today. Andy Brown looks after the fleet category at Blue Light Commercial. Andy Butterfield joins us from National Highways, where he's Customer Services Director. Chris Rutherford leads on ambulance transformation for London Ambulance Service. And Paul Leach joins us from NHS England, where he is a National Ambulance Lead in the Net Zero Travel and Transport team. So, as I said at the introduction to the webinar, what I'd like to do is to take us a little bit back to the show, back in September, and to get some idea of the experience that people have had by being part of the show. Andy Butterfield joined us in the Innovation Theatre, where he spoke about how National Highways is having to introduce electric vehicles into its fleet and the consequences of having electric vehicles on our network. Andy, can you give us a quick recap of National Highways, your experience at talking at the show and the kind of things that you shared with our visitors?
Yeah, so really enjoyed the show. Got to look around the whole event as well. I talked, as you say, on the innovation stage. I was talking largely about our journey with electric vehicles and plug-in hybrids, and the challenges that will face us and partners going forwards in the recovery of those vehicles and having lots more of those vehicles on the network as well. So in the space of our own journey, we've moved to plug-in hybrids for our traffic officer vehicles and fully electric vehicles for some of our vehicles already. We've got the same challenges, I guess, as other organisations here. We've got to move to pretty much fully electric by 2025. We've got a little bit longer for our traffic officer vehicles, so 2027 for most vehicles, 2030 for traffic officer vehicles. The traffic officer vehicles at the moment are pretty much all plug-in hybrid 4x4 vehicles, and some of the challenge that we're facing is finding the right vehicles to replace those 4x4s. We've got a lot of BMWs and Volvo 4x4s currently. We've just taken our first tranche of 5 fully electric vehicles, and those are being trialled at the moment with our traffic officers. Then we've got our larger fleet as well, so our SALT fleet that has got to move to 90% reduced carbon emissions by 2040, which is a real challenge because we're not currently able to find vehicles to replace those on the market. So a lot of challenges ahead in our own vehicle space, and we've tried to get ahead of the curve by employing some electric vehicles already and really testing them out on the network to try and find out what they can and can't do in the current ways of working.
Right. Okay, that's interesting about the testing. I wonder, you've set out there some of the problems and whether the actual vehicles can do the job you want them to do. And I wonder if that's something that we find in police as well. So Andy Brown, you came from Blue Light Commercial to the show, you had a stand there, and you have a lot to do with police in terms of them wanting to improve their fleet and the different types of vehicles. And Andy Butterfield talked about different types. You also have that issue as well. I wonder if you could share with us conversations you were having at the show about police and any concerns they have about greening their fleets.
Yeah, absolutely, and I would say we share the same views as Andy does. We have very similar vehicle types in some of those elements. From that perspective, policing has a particular challenge around those larger type vehicles, and particularly then the payload that's required to carry them. And yeah, I was exhibiting at the show for 2 days on the Blue Light Commercial stand. There was an awful lot of conversations with both stakeholders and with suppliers, and with the supply chain around move to EVs, and how we can aim to facilitate that, and we can aim to support that from that perspective. We're very much in the infancy. Less than 2% of police fleet is fully EV at the moment, so it is quite limited from that point of view. And obviously, one of the key indications and key discussion points at the time, which was more of a timing thing, was the week in which the Prime Minister actually announced the rollback to 2035 on EV vehicles that week. So obviously there was lots of discussion and challenge around that, but I think it's very much kind of an industry kind of acceptance now that although that date's been rolled back, certainly vehicle manufacturers are in a position where they are already moving towards the 2030 date, and quite frankly, an awful lot more are even earlier than that. So it was useful to kind of understand that although that date shifted from government, that's not necessarily going to change the outlook from a manufacturer point of view as well.
Interesting timing as well for that announcement. So for this webinar, we talked very much in the introduction and the advertising for it about it being a three-part problem. And you and Andy have both talked about the beginning of this problem, which is the actual supply. How do you find the vehicles and are they fit for purpose? We're also going to talk about the maintenance, which is the second part of the problem. And the third part is how do you keep them charged? How do you keep them on the road? You've given us a couple of thoughts about different issues with police and with the highways in terms of performance. I wonder if we can look at ambulance now to get a sense of what that looks like. But I think it's a different world with ambulances. So I just wonder, Chris or Paul, which one of you'd like to start by perhaps just mapping out what the situation is for ambulance in terms of target, and also how ambulances are kind of put on the road, and how do you take one and make it electric? Can you just give us I don't mind who takes that, whichever you want to.
Yeah, so I mean, I can cover off some of it. So I work for London Ambulance, and Paul works for NHS England, sort of greener NHS. So in London, we have specific issues, or not issues, we have specific targets around. It was the low emission zone, then it was the ultra low emission zone, and then we are fully expecting a zero emission zone. Having sort of fairly close relationship with the GLA and Transport for London, we are still of the opinion that the Mayor wants to be a zero emission city by 2030, and that is something that London would want to comply with. Now, we have missed the sort of ULEZ slightly, so we had a derogation in place for London, and that was agreed with the Mayor because our normal amount that we spend on ambulances, we wanted to spend a little bit more on the electric infrastructure and electric ambulances, which meant that we couldn't necessarily transition as many vehicles over to that, but it allowed us to do that sort of pioneering piece of work. So we've got probably slightly different timelines to pull sort of nationally, but we're still working towards that sort of 2030. Paul, do you want to cover the national picture?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think it's worth starting off with what the national targets are for the NHS fleet in total, which obviously includes ambulances. So in line with the government's targets, we expect that all new vehicles owned and leased by the NHS will be zero emission from 2027 moving forward. So that's all new vehicles. We don't sort of intend to retire vehicles early to swap them out. We're just going to phase them out from 2027 moving forwards. That doesn't include emergency ambulances. They'll come in slightly later. So we think from about 2030, all emergency ambulances, new ones, will be zero emission. The target then actually is 2035. So all vehicles owned and leased by the NHS again, not including ambulances, will be zero emission by 2035. And then we think with the recycle times that we've got for frontline emergency ambulances, we should have a fully zero emission fleet for those by about 2040. Your original question asked about the market and availability of vehicles. I think it's worth touching on that as well. So in the last 18 months, we've seen really extended lead times for the smaller vehicles, the cars and the SUVs. That is an improving picture, very much rapidly improving. So those lead times are shortening. And there's quite a variation of vehicles available to ambulance trusts of that nature, cars and the SUV size things. We've got them in the fleet already. We've done some work that I'll come on to later. From an ambulance point of view, we haven't had vehicles available that would work as ambulances. Until very recently, we've been lucky enough that Ford came forward with their e-transit, and that's what Chris and London sort of have built their prototype on. I'm glad to say actually that's proven successful so far, and there are a number of trusts around the country willing to take those on now as a pilot.
Okay, and in terms of London, so you have one on the road now, or are you going to operation soon?
So we've had it delivered. It's just been through its IVA. We're currently in the process of prepping it. I think that's actually done this week now, and then it will go over to our training colleagues. So they'll do their training pack, and then they'll train the staff that will be using it. And then we are aiming to have that on the road, hopefully for New Year's Eve.
Okay, so that's one new electric ambulance in London that you want to test.
So we've bought 4 in total. So we should get the second one in December that will be deployed in January, and then the other 2. We kind of touched on it before. We had the other 2 with a converter, and that converter has since gone into administration. So we're now planning to have another converter do the 2 of those base vehicles that we had at the other converter. So.
Right. So it's interesting. So you're buying the bits and putting them together to create the electric ambulance. Is that the same for police and for you, Andy Butterfield, in terms of the actual highways? You're not able to just buy them off the shelf. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to make them fit for purpose. Andy Brown, do you want to show on police first?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, there is. We choose to buy them in a mixture of ways. So sometimes we will buy a base vehicle, and we will look to convert that ourselves, probably similar to what Chris is discussing there. And I'm saying ourselves by contracting separately for that type of requirement. But we do have vehicles, particularly cars, that we do have what we describe as one-stop shop options, where the manufacturer actually deals with that whole conversion and that conversion process from that perspective. But yeah, they obviously do need a fair bit of work. I don't think it's probably fair to say probably not as much work as what and conversion that an ambulance would need from a base Ford Transit, e-transit. But there is certainly a need to convert those, even as much as putting the flashing lights and the blue and yellow stickers all over the vehicles as a
but that would be common to any type of vehicle, wouldn't it? It's not an electric issue, presumably.
No,
Andy Butterfield, and I wonder, in terms of the 4x4s that you talked about, in terms of their ability to do the job you need, do they require a lot of work in terms of getting an electric version on the road?
Yeah, similar to the others. We take them all to converters. I don't think electric vehicles per se take any additional work.
Right.
It's just a different set of works. They're laid out differently. They obviously have battery packs in there. We supplement those for the additional lighting, etc. But it is just a conversion process. That's not the most challenging thing. It's the change of vehicle type. That means that we're having to change how we set them out.
Right. Okay. Well, I think that's what leads us on nicely. I was going to talk to you about budget, but actually I'm going to skip past budget for now and talk about sort of keeping them on the road. So once you start to get these new vehicles into your fleets, whether they are 4x4s, rapid response vehicles, the very fast police cars, the ambulances, how do we make sure that the people who are maintaining them and looking after them in your workshops, whether you have them in-house or whether you buy those services in, have the skills to do it? Is that something that you've looked at so far? Can I ask, perhaps on the ambulance side, what are your thoughts on that in terms of how we get to make sure workshops are able to deal with the vehicles that you're going to be changing to?
Yeah, so we have in-house workshops, and we have some outsourced services as well. We've been working very closely with Ford, as we've kind of alluded to. They've been pretty pivotal in developing an electric response car for us, and then the first lightweight original equipment manufacturer ambulance. So we've been sort of very closely working with them, improving our tooling, our diagnostics within the workshop. We've started training the managers in the workshops on a specific program, and the technicians as well. In terms of the EVs, there's sort of some e-learning that can be done, which is fairly straightforward. And then we're actually developing a master tech position. So similar that you see in industry, where you get a very highly qualified mechanic. They will have sort of specialist EV training and be able to do some of the more specialist maintenance work rather than just your run-of-the-mill servicing.
Right. And do you anticipate bringing in apprentices who will be able to start essentially being EV maintenance people in your workshops? Is that something that could evolve? Is there a scheme or anything that can be used?
Yeah, I think we're looking into apprentices at the moment. It's not hugely the area that I cover, but I am of the opinion that we're doing one.
Okay. Anybody else got anything to offer in terms of maintenance and having to think about the back office, as it were, in the workshops?
I think the only thing I would highlight, Catherine, is that there are quite significant challenges in that industry at the moment about retaining labour and getting labour into that market. There is very much a kind of an ageing workforce in that area, and not as many people coming through into that industry. So that is causing a pinch point, and that's not just in emergency services, that's in that profession, quite frankly, from that perspective. So I think that brings its own unique set of challenges across the board as well.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's anything around motor services as an employer not paying as much as perhaps in the private sector, whether you're competing with people wanting to maintain these vehicles, because I could buy one and go to a workshop.
Yeah, I think there's an element of that challenge, I think, but I also think that there are some emergency services that have been paying a premium for those workers and are still finding that quite difficult, to be honest with you. Right.
Okay. So anybody from motor services watching this webinar, perhaps something to think about is how you actually, it's fine buying the vehicles, but actually keeping them on the road and keeping your staff up to skilled is all part of that strategy, presumably, of moving forward. Paul, at a national level, do you see much around that in terms of how ambulance services will maintain these new ambulances as they move forward?
We don't, to be fair. The ambulance trusts in the country are generally self-sufficient, so they work as an organisation within their own right. So it's not really something we sort of dabble in. It's up to the trust themselves. And general comment is, from what I've seen across the country, they're very much on the front foot with this. They're very much like Chris and London Ambulance Service. They've all got schemes to upskill their existing workforce ahead of the transition towards EVs, which is really positive. Actually, it's good to see.
Yes. Okay. And I think, Andy Butterfield, is it right? National Highways, you outsource all of your maintenance of vehicles. Are you getting anything back from your suppliers in terms of the ability to find people to do the job?
So we do outsource all of that, but we have had some challenges with some of those contracts already. Much like the others have said, it's a challenging market at the moment. So we are aware of that, and we are seeking to get onto the front foot with it. But it's not an easy position to be at the moment.
Right. Okay. So just returning slightly, if I may, to what we were talking about just now in terms of the vehicles themselves, and to actually be able to find the right kind of vehicles that you want. What conversations do you have with suppliers? You've mentioned Ford, Chris, but in terms of other vehicle manufacturers, do you talk to them about how you innovate to get what you need? How does that work? Andy Brown, do you do that at Blue Light Commercial? How do you have those conversations? Kind of say, this is actually what we need. It needs to go faster. Can it do this? How does that work?
Absolutely. We do have those conversations. I was having one of those conversations with a vehicle manufacturer just yesterday. if I'm being perfectly honest, there is only so much that we can do. We're at the beheaded of the manufacturers in terms of where their development cycles are, what vehicles they're looking to have on the road, and their priorities in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, so that they don't get fined and they don't fall foul of those type of elements. But there are elements, for example, that we've worked with vehicle manufacturers around. Quite police specific around removing things like driver aids, utilisation of certain tactics, of TPAT tactics, which in effect is making contact with another vehicle. If you drive a fairly modern car, you'll realise that that's more difficult than you actually think, because it will brake automatically for you if you're going towards another vehicle. Actually being able to kind of disable that in kind of pursuit situations and those kind of situations are the type of things that we work with them on. So it's kind of more nuanced rather than saying we need a vehicle that does X, Y, and Z. It's maybe about the intricacies of that specific vehicle that's potentially available on the market.
Okay. And in terms of your 4x4 needs, are you talking directly to the manufacturer? Are you able to do that?
Yeah, so we're talking
to do that.
We're talking to as many manufacturers as we can. We use 4x4s for what we describe as carriageway clearance, which is essentially dragging vehicles out of live lanes. And some of those vehicles have obviously been damaged, but we want to get the motorway reflowing as quickly as possible. Electric vehicles don't have the same capabilities to pull other vehicles. The 4x4s we've used for many years, the plug-in hybrids don't have quite the same power, but we can still move lots of vehicles out of a live lane. We probably won't be able to do that with electric vehicles. Twofold reason. One is the other vehicle is much more likely to be electric and therefore heavier with batteries on it as well, and they don't have the same sort of torque pulling power electric vehicles. So we do have a real challenge in that space, and we've the 5 vehicles that we've currently got are out there being tested to see what they can and can't do in terms of that carriageway clearance, as well as everything else that we have them doing. Yeah.
Right. Okay. And you wrote for us in the June issue of Motor Services Times about this experience that you're having in national highways, and you mentioned something about a slippery gym. Do you want to just explain what that is in terms of helping you with that carriageway clearance?
So we've got a couple of tools that we rolled out into our vehicles. One of them is a slippery gym, and it basically gets hammered under the wheel of a vehicle and has low friction with the road surface, so enables us to pull vehicles that where the tyres have gone flat or the suspension's been damaged, etc. So that gives us a bit more capability, but we're still finding that the towing capacity is much lower in electric vehicles. And we're not quite sure whether that will change with the ever-increasing market of electric vehicles, or whether that's something that we'll have to live with going forwards. So we're keeping a very close eye on the whole market. Yeah.
Okay, so I think that brings us nicely into the third part of our problem, which is all about the batteries and how do you keep them charged. We talked, I know Andy before, about range anxiety and people's concern about their vehicles not getting to where they want them to go. So really, it's all about infrastructure now, our conversation. So let's talk investment. So what does it look like? Let's go back to London. So Chris, how does London's infrastructure work when you've got a London Ambulance Service, London Fire Brigade, the Met Police, big geographical area, you're all buying your own EVs in lots of different ways. How are you keeping them charged, and how are you talking to each other to make sure you're doing it in a consistent way?
Yeah, it's hard work. I think collaboration you've kind of briefly touched on, Catherine, and we have we've been engaged with the GLA, with Transport for London, with the Met Police, the Fire Brigade, and other trusts. And in theory, that's the right thing to do. And for big sort of investment collaborations, I think there's some good theory behind that. The trouble is, we all have different governance, we have different security protocols and things like that, particularly with the Met Police. So that's limited some of our sort of interoperability. What we have found is we're working really closely with hospitals now. So 2 of our hospitals where the first of our electric ambulances are based are now putting rapid chargers onto their aprons. So when we drop off a patient, we can be dwelling there from, I think the target time is about 18 minutes, anything up to about 45, which is ample opportunity to get a decent amount of charge back into an ambulance, so that actually we don't have to charge it when we're back at station. We can continue and go and see more patients. So that side of things is working really well. Broadly speaking, we've been doing sort of electrification of our site since 2018. So we've got around 27 kilowatt low powered chargers. We've just fitted our 40th 22 kilowatt charger, and they're primarily for the response cars. And then we are just embarking on a sort of a rapid charger rollout now. So we've got the physical units, and we're working with our charge point operator, the DNOs, and where necessary, the local authorities to get those installed. But our biggest barrier is budget. So typically a substation, around the UK may cost about 150k. In London, particularly, congested areas, limited supplies, because you're supplying skyscrapers and goodness knows what else. We're having quotes of kind of 900,000 for a substation up at Waterloo and 500,000 for a substation at Oval. That actually, even with the sort of increased request for power, we're being told we're not going to be able to get all of it. So we're having to look at alternative solutions. So it's really challenged, but by far and away the hardest thing for us is the budget, because we're at the moment making the infrastructure part of our capital programme, and there just isn't sufficient for what we want to do in addition to buying the vehicles that we want to buy.
That 900k figure that you just quoted, is that for a substation for sole ambulance service use?
Yeah.
Okay, because Andy Butterfield, when we spoke, you talked about putting new substations or new electricity outlets, I'm not sure the words here, on service stations along the motorway and the A roads.
Yeah.
Is those sorts of is that a number that you recognise?
Yeah, so
Chris has talked about.
We have a slightly different problem in that where we want the electricity supply is often rural areas where we've got depots and outstations near to motorways that are already at their sort of full electricity capacity. So we have been quoted in rural areas where obviously land's relatively cheap, £500,000 for substations because of the amount of wiring that you need to get to them. So I'm not overly surprised by those kind of numbers in London, but yeah, relatively low capacity charging is available in a lot of locations, but obviously that charging can take hours and hours to fill up a vehicle. So we're thinking we may have to have an enlarged fleet in order to accommodate for low capacity charging for a period of time whilst the DNOs and the electricity companies catch up with this peak in demand over the next few years.
Okay, that's interesting. Andy Brown, on the police side of things, what are police telling you in terms of their need to put infrastructure in and the challenges they're facing? Is it similar? Is it a budget issue? Is it a strategy issue? How does it work?
Yeah, it's very similar in that respect, and I don't think those numbers are out of kilter. I think the other thing that we're getting feedback on is that lead time for those substations and that work to take place as well is quite extensive, particularly if it's at the larger end from a substation point of view as well. Obviously, that does vary around the country in that respect, so that's a real challenge for forces. Obviously, a lot of police stations are relatively old buildings that don't necessarily have a significantly high capacity at site that's now available, and again that causes that concern around actually having EV chargers at sites isn't a particularly expensive proposition if you have the capacity at the site. If you don't have the capacity at site, it clearly creates a real challenge from that point of view. But coming back to probably your point on strategy, and I think that's probably where we're slightly a couple of steps behind, where Chris and Andy have kind of referenced, is there's an awful lot of police forces that have yet to kind of strategize and work out exactly where they need the resource, what the low-hanging fruit is, how they can go about doing that, and how they can get some of those quick wins. I don't think we're even in that quick win kind of territory at the moment from that point of view. So it's really useful to learn some stuff from Andy and Chris and Paul's input into that space as well, to be honest.
Right, excellent. So that's a very nice lead into Paul Leach. We talked in our briefing, Paul, about the data work that you've been doing in terms of using what you know about the way in which ambulance services work and how they operate in order to determine the best place to put charging and how that works. So it touches a little bit on what Chris has said in terms of the behaviours, but do you want to talk a little bit about how you've done that at a strategic level to create a sense of what's needed where?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. So the early part of 2022, the Net Zero Travel and Transport team went into partnership with a not-for-profit organisation called CENEX, the Centre of Excellence for Low Carbon and Fuel Cell Vehicles. Now, their expertise is in transitioning large fleets to zero emission. So we wanted to ask a few fundamental questions of them to help us sort of picture what the fleets look like. Primarily, we needed to understand from a double crewed ambulance point of view, what's the truth about the duty cycle? How many miles are they doing per day, per year? You know, how many hours a day is the engine ignition off? How many is it on? Where do they spend their time? Are they outside hospitals? Are they outside ambulance stations, people's homes? We really needed to dig deep and really understand that. So we commissioned what we termed a duty cycle study for 12 months. We took telemetry data from each of the trusts for their entire double crewed ambulance fleet for a year. CENEX helped us analyse that data and millions of lines of data. And that gave us a picture then of what a future ambulance needs to look like, what the energy requirement is for that vehicle. Most likely going to be electric rather than hydrogen, but that's what we modelled. So we think we've probably got the most in-depth understanding now of what the ambulance fleet looks like. Now we've got that picture, we can then build an infrastructure plan around that. So what we think would be the best way to charge those vehicles. So a couple of headline figures from that. First of all, even the most busy ambulance in the country has its ignition off for 15 hours a day. Now that's not necessarily in a place where you could charge it. It's most likely to be outside somebody's house. But where we do have long dwell times, particularly outside hospitals, that obviously becomes a place where you would want to put an EV charger. The modelling we've done suggests actually that for the vehicles we've got at the moment, so the 68 kilowatt hour vehicle, if we charge that for 45 minutes every 12-hour shift, so that's a 90-minute period in a day, we can keep the wheels turning on that vehicle. Most likely charging at the ambulance station as a primary point, secondary point outside a hospital. And actually that's a key thing for us. We've learned that we don't need ultra rapid, super expensive charge points. We can probably get away with fairly low kilowatt hours, 22s, maybe up to 40s. And what we actually propose is that rather than having a high number of individual charge points, we can use smart charging. So a single charging hub, which may have a capacity of 200 kilowatts, and then multiple connections to that as well. That will then smart charge between a number of vehicles, so that the one that needs the charge the most will get the most sort of kilowatt hours at that point. So there's a lot of science behind that, a lot of sense behind it. Where we've seen some positive outcomes there is that actually drives the cost down. So with that hub idea, we've driven the cost down, and we think in the next 10 years, so this is for the entire ambulance fleet in the country, we're going to be looking at about £65 million worth of hardware across the 10 trusts over 10 years. You can probably double that at least for then the DNO upgrades we're going to require, so the grid support, the substations, the cables that need to go under the ground. So in the order of about £130 million. That's what we've predicted. We don't actually, as an NHS, understand our estate fully. So we don't know what our capacity is on sites. We're starting to collect that data to give us an idea of what headroom we've already got. So where we can get those quick wins that Andy talked about, where can we get a charger in quite quickly? There's capacity there, the costs will be low. We've got a competing work stream with this though. So in the NHS, we're also decarbonising our heat. So we're looking at air source heat pumps, which are also electrically powered. So where we have capacity, we have to consider both those pieces of work going in. So that's going to be a challenge for estate colleagues as well. So we do work nationally with estate colleagues to look at that whole piece. And I'll just, while I go on about this, we've just started something called the Long-Term NHS Infrastructure Strategy project work. It's a 6-month project now. That's going to consider finance, estates. We're going to look at the NHS's long-term workforce plan. So as we increase the number of staff, we might need to increase the number of vehicles. We might need to increase the number of buildings we've got. So it's actually a massive piece of work going on for about the next 6 months to really get a picture of what the costs are going to be. And then we'll take that to the government for the next comprehensive spending review, say, this is what we need. Over to you.
Yeah. So, okay. All right. So that's really interesting to kind of put EVs within the context of that broader drive towards net zero and the potential competition with other aspects of that agenda and probably other agendas, which at a government level will lead to a fist fight between ministers, I expect. So really interesting to hear about how that's working nationally. I just want to draw in a couple of our questions because we've had one which is a couple which are quite popular. I'll take the second one first, actually, which is about the National Risk Register. So we've just had an update actually on the National Resilience Framework, which was published this week by the government. So it's kind of brought it quite into my mind because I've been having a look at it. And one of the risks in the risk register is about a national power outage. And we talked to Helen Hines and Rob Simpson in our first webinar about Mighty Oak, which was an exercise that sort of tested that. The question here is about what you're going to do if the electricity goes off and what the mitigation is for that. In terms of your strategy and planning, I mean, maybe Andy Brown or Andy Butterfield, what are your thoughts in terms of how you, what happens when the power goes off, even if it's just a local outage?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit. We obviously do some contingency planning for all of our buildings and our locations. We're lucky in that we have lots of depots and outstations spread across the country, so we do have a bit of resilience in being able to move vehicles around. But once we've moved to all electric vehicles, that would be a real challenge. At the moment, plug-in hybrids obviously can still operate quite happily, but when we move to electric vehicles, we will find that a long outage will limit our ability to respond.
Okay, so certainly part of the planning process. There's another question here about capacity of the batteries to operate in severe weather conditions. The question here comes from somebody who's in Cumbria and talks about a major incident in Cumbria due to heavy snowfalls, whether drains batteries on EVs, presumably because they're kind of heating up the cars. I don't know, maybe these are the reasons. But any thoughts on extreme weather, whether very hot or very cold? Have you thought about that in terms of your planning? Anybody like to come in on that one?
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, I mean,
go on, sorry, Chris. Go on, Chris, you're right. No, go ahead.
So Chris, and then Andy.
So EVs are definitely impacted by sort of changeable conditions. They like to be at a sort of a medium temperature. So any extremes, hot or cold, can impact on that. I think certainly most EV drivers will have seen their range drop off during winter. So, I mean, I drive an EV that would do 260 miles in summer, and I'm getting about 190 at the moment. So it's a reasonable detriment, but that's part of my planning. When we've put vehicles into service in London, we have made sure that there is plenty of resilience for that. So the response car fleet, as an example, the WLTP range is about 330 miles on those. Now, there's no way that we're getting that in London anyway, but even with response car driving and the sort of the degradation in range due to weather, we're still not going to be anywhere near a shift or even 2 shifts, for range. So I think you've got to build in that resilience. The ambulance is going to be slightly less resilient in that regard because a 68 kilowatt hour range or battery is going to last comfortably a shift, but I don't think we'd push much beyond that at the moment. We'll certainly test that quite rigorously on a sort of an 8, 10 and a 12-hour shift to start with and see how that performs.
Yeah, I wonder if NWAS would have a different approach given their sort of rurality of their sort of landscape.
Yeah, and their mileage as well. Their mileage will be probably
so it's
twice that.
Northwest Ambulance Service. Sorry, I'm using an acronym there. Andy Brown, you had something in that.
Yeah, I think I was just going to probably support exactly what Chris was saying. Really, is that clearly the weather has an impact as well as the driving style. And we've done some work with European colleagues that suggests potentially that that the range can be up to 50% less, whether that's on a kind of a response vehicle driving or a mixture of response vehicle driving and very cold or very warm vehicle driving, which does pose a real challenge to us. And there probably isn't a perfect solution at the moment around vehicles losing power. Just coming back to some of maybe the contingency planning elements. Might be elements of storage and electrical storage that we could potentially look at in the future. That is something that we're exploring, particularly around maybe some of the limitations at sites of being able to get capacity in any kind of pace. That actually electrical storage might be an effective way to do that, or actually taking electricity directly from solar panels or wind generation options, etc. Those type of things as well.
Okay, all right. So we're coming up to the end of our session. I just want to capture before we finish something around the joined up approach to the future. There is the Emergency Services Sustainability Group, which I'll quote what it does. It says it brings blue lights together to share best practice and to discuss emerging technologies. We talked a little bit just now about putting EVs into the context of the wider sort of green agenda. It strikes me that a group like that is the place to have conversations about learning from each other. I wondered if any of you had been part of that group, or whether you have any other sort of local equivalents that you're having those multi-agency discussions to tap into each other's solutions and help each other. Would you like to come in on that one?
I can come in there, Catherine. So I'm now sort of working with that very group, actually, the Emergency Services Environmental Sustainability Group. The whole point of my link up there is to join the conversation up between the 3 blue light services and actually anybody else in the similar situation, whether that's, HM Coast Guard or whoever, to identify what the common problems are. Clearly funding is one of them for all of us. Where does the funding come from? But where can we share learning, and then how can we work together as well? So what's the point in the NHS spending a fortune on an infrastructure that the police and fire services can't use, and vice versa? Why can we not share that infrastructure? And what's available nationally as well? Can we use the public infrastructure? And if we're going to do that, how do we get priority access to it? How can we guarantee when a police vehicle comes to a public charger, it gets access straight away when it needs it? The point of that is then to represent upwards towards central government, say, look, we have a blue light problem here. It needs funding, it needs resolving, and equally, there's a resilience point, which we've already touched on. What's the resilience capability? So we now link with that group with the Energy Networks Association as well to present the problem to them. So they're going to supply the electricity. What resilience can they give us? The word on the street is that you're most likely to get a regional power outage rather than a national one. However, national could happen. So what's the resilience look like? And then where there's a gap, how do we collaborate to replace? At the minute, we carry 20 days of bunkered fuel. What does that look like in EV world? How can we transition to EV storage?
Interesting. Yes. I wonder, in terms of that joined up conversation that goes towards what will be a comprehensive spending review at some point in the new government, new parliament. Andy Butterfield, in terms of are you Cat 1 or Cat 2 responder under this?
So we're Cat 2 responder, but
how do we embrace you into that conversation that Paul is talking about? Because you're talking about the Cat 1s. So I wonder how that would be helpful to an organisation like yours.
Yeah, and there's some things that we can offer. Obviously, we use park up points on motorways, which are equally used by police colleagues. So we're exploring the capability of having some form of top-up charging at some of those points. So joining up with police colleagues with that would be really helpful. We're also working with the Department for Transport, looking and motorway service areas, looking at providing and enhancing charging facilities and battery storage at those locations as well. There's no reason why we couldn't be having conversations about prioritisation for blue light services and for anybody from the Contingency Act at those locations as well. So I definitely think there's a joined up approach here. We've all kind of talked about trying to solve our own problems for obvious reasons. But working together would make a lot more sense in this space. And if we could have the kind of hubs that Chris talked about that could be used with a prioritised way for all of us, then that would make a lot more sense and be a lot more value for money than each of us solving our own problems, I think.
Yes, absolutely. And that's why I think that that's the beauty of these conversations through webinars like this, where we can actually have these conversations, realise these commonalities, and perhaps give yourselves something to go away and think about, but also the people watching us who may be thinking, actually, we need to do some of this joined up thinking as well. This is very much a collaboration and partnership piece, and that the duty to collaborate would come in nicely here. So this is all good. We have come to the end of our 45 minutes. I'm just going to do a little summary of what we've discussed. So in terms of the three-part problem, the market and the ability of you to be able to find the vehicles you need is still not quite there, and quite a lot of work to do. But it sounds to me like you're having conversations with the suppliers, and that the innovation is happening, that perhaps not as fast as one might like, but the conversations are happening, and I think that's really positive. In terms of maintenance and looking after the vehicles, seems that you feel quite positive about that, but I think maybe something we could drill into perhaps in a future webinar about how we maintain these things with some of the organisations involved with that. And then the third point about charging seems to me the big issue. How do you join you all up? How do we make sure that it's all done in the most cost efficient way? When you've got London with very different experience to rural Cumbria, as we got from our question there. So still a lot of work to do, but it sounds like that group, Paul, how often does that meet, this Emergency Services Environmental Sustainability Group?
I think the group meets regularly. The conversations I've been having are a little bit more ad hoc, because we're actually just forming a position statement at the moment, and then we'll formalise that and then take it forward as a group.
You mean the group, sorry, is formalising that?
Yes, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so that's police, fire, myself as NHS, and then colleagues from Electricity Networks Association as well.
Right. Okay. And of course, we haven't had fire on this conversation, and there's only so many people we can fit on this screen. So we'd like to pick that up with them perhaps in the future. Is there anything else you'd like to add before I draw us to a close? Are we all happy with all of that?
I think I've got a final point. If I may.
Yeah, sure.
If I may just come in, I think what we're looking at the moment is a point in time, isn't it? We're working with the technology that's available to us. One of the key things we do as NHS England is horizon scan, and I'm sure everybody's doing the same thing. Technology moves quickly, the developments move quickly. We're talking about solid state batteries in a couple of years' time from Toyota. That doubles the range and it halves the weight, reduces the fire risk. So we're just on a journey at the moment. I think we're just in the first sort of foothills of that transition, aren't we? So this is about a moment in time. Come back in 2 years, the world might be a different place. Hopefully.
Well, in that case, I shall put a note in my diary. We'll have the same webinar in 2 years, and we'll see where you've all got to. So thank you so much for your time today. I'm just going to do our closing remarks now. So thank you very much for coming and joining us today, our speakers, and those of you watching and on catch up. Webinar will be available for catch up via our website from the same place from Crowdcast. We'll also put any notes up there as well. I'm planning to do some write up, and there's a few notes about places and things you can go to read. This is the final webinar in this first series from Emergency Services Times, but we are looking to do some more, so watch this space. You can see the other two webinars and this one on catch up from our website, emergencyservicestimes.com, which we relaunched this week. So go and have a look, because it's very exciting and I'm very proud of it. So you can sign up for regular newsletters to find out what we're doing, because we're going to do lots of new things. And just leaves me to say thank you very much for watching. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.